All right. So I think the good part about having a couple classes in rapid succession is most of what we talked about on Tuesday hopefully hasn't leaked out your brain just yet. And maybe some of it will have kind of solidified and sunk in. So today we're going to get into the details behind how do we apply basic styling to our HTML page. And as I said last time, we have most of the elements that we need to build most web pages. You know, if we have a doc type, an HTML tag, a head, a body, a div, and a span, we have enough to do most things we need to do if we can style them nicely. The additional tags we're going to learn as we go forward are really just there to improve readability, to improve semantics, and to make it easier to edit and maintain as we go to build bigger and more complex things. So when we talk about making things look nice, that's where we're getting into CSS, or cascading style sheets. So we're going to get into that today and start to introduce all of the real things behind what makes your application or your site or your page that you're building look great. Now, one of the things we looked at the other day is the fact that, you know, most basic web pages, just the HTML on their own, are really quite boring, and in some cases not even visible. They're simplistic. They have very few kind of font choices. They have very limited kind of layout options. The defaults for every tag that are built into the HTML standard are really quite dull, and they're designed that way on purpose. That's there so that you are encouraged to go beyond and fix up how things work and how things look. So if we understand how the browser is going to interpret our HTML, we can also understand how the browser is going to interpret the way our styling information works. And it all starts from what we call the box model. I had you guys do this last time. We drew the diagram of my little cat page. And this is a little bit more formal diagram, and it doesn't really matter about the details. The concept here stays the same regardless of whether you're building a single page app, or a multi-page site. The HTML and CSS doesn't change depending on those things, and the way we design it and build it doesn't change. We still need a basic design. And that basic design is some layout on paper of how all of our content is going to sit together. And we wrap that content in boxes. And as we wrap the content in boxes, we want to lay those boxes out. We want to take advantage of what CSS gives us to figure out how the boxes are related to each other and how the boxes flow one box to the next. Now, every box becomes an HTML div, but the information about how those boxes fit together, that gets listed in that particular box's cascading style sheets. Every box has the same collection of styles attached to it. And the values for those styles is what determines the difference between what one box looks like and another, the width of one box, the height of a box, whether it's got borders and spacing. So if we distill it down and look at just one div, one box, we can start to pull apart some of the more core fundamental styles that we can apply to that box. And it's easiest to see this in a diagram. When we look at this box, we think of our content in the middle. So we've got a div, and inside the div is some content. The content dictates the width and height of the box. The box will stretch to be just big enough to fit the content. Once we have the size of the box in two specific attributes, the width and the height, and they get computed for us. We can then add to that by adding padding, borders, and margins. Now, the padding goes between your content and the border. And the border goes in between the margin and the padding, and the margin is from the border out. In other words, the margin helps you identify how much space is between this box and the next one. And the padding is how much space between your content and the edge of the box. So you can think of the border as where the box is. Margin outside, padding inside. All of those things can be changed, manipulated, configured using a cascading style sheet. And a cascading style sheet is nothing more than a collection of styles loaded into a single file that we will load externally in the head section. Now we'll talk a bit in the lesson today about what the cascade part of this is. Now all of our content is segregated into divs or boxes, and that's all HTML. We can attach a style attribute to any div. And in that style attribute, we can add styling information. And these styling information bits are overrides. We're overriding the default values. So the default values for margins is 0 size. The default value for padding is 0 size. And the default size for the border is 0 size. So when we create some content in a div, the only things that have been overridden is where the browser has figured out how wide the content is and how tall the content is. Now the browser thinks of everything as a document. That's how it was originally designed. And this only creates a problem if the thing you're building isn't a document, if it's an application. If it is a document, you can just let it flow. The content will dictate the width. If you have a large paragraph, it will take a look at the width of the browser, and it will wrap the text at the width of the browser. And the height of the div will be dictated by how much space it needs to fill up that particular amount of content. So manipulating the padding, the margin, and the border are the first few bits of our styling information that we can add to a div. And they're done through attributes that you would expect. Now these attributes are called styles. And each style affects some part of the box model. The styles are literally named margin, border, padding. The content is actually dictated by the width and the height. And you set these things by setting the style attribute on an HTML element. Now, when we put this together, we can start to diagram out, say, our biography. And that's where we sit down and go, okay, instead of just writing some HTML and hoping for the best and rewriting it and rewriting it and rewriting it, what we really want to do is we want to figure out, okay, what is the problem we're solving? What are we trying to design and build? Let's put together a plan. Let's put together that diagram. And we did that last time with our All About Cats. Remember All About Cats? Let's just zoom in a little bit here. Oops. Put that there. Put that there. Show you All About Cats. Remember All About Cats? It's an exciting page. It's a page everybody wants to read. We can't wait to publish this page, but, frankly, it looks like ass right now. So we're going to have to make it better before All About Cats actually goes live and goes public. So we're going to, first of all, start with a plan. And my plan here has lots and lots of boxes on it. We're going to zoom in a little bit. And as we design our page, we're just going to start with some boxes. Now, there are some interesting parts that we get to do when we're doing some design work, and I'm not going to dive deep into a lot of design work. I'm going to leave that to your other instructors when we talk about design. Over time, we realize a couple things. First of all the basic rules of layout that are built into the browser aren't going to help you. You have to set those things up on your own. The second one is, the classic photography rule of thirds or golden ratio triangles work here on the web really well. People know what I mean by the rule of thirds and golden ratio triangles? Right? Okay. And the golden ratio triangles is kind of putting math behind what just kind of aesthetically looks good. It's a Fibonacci thing. You remember your math from high school? Right. Anyone remember what a golden rectangle is? Yes. No.
No.
It's easier to draw it than to do the math. See if I can put it this way. Oops. Yeah. Let's do that. So a golden rectangle. Oops. Color. Something there. Not a very good one. A golden rectangle is a rectangle when you slice off a square, so these two sides are the same. The rectangle that's remaining is a golden rectangle as well. So you can slice off a square, and the rectangle that's remaining is a golden rectangle. So the ratio of the length to the width, or the height, is always the same. And how does that fit into design? Well, if you're thinking about when we study human factors and we start breaking things up into rectangles and squares, what happens is your focal point for your eye ends up in one spot, and it's not the center. And strangely enough, if you actually keep subdividing these things, you kind of get a nice ratio and a nice layout. And if we think about this as our web page, or even turn it on its side, do it top to bottom, you're going to end up with a point that's of most interest that people's eyes gravitate towards. Now, if I turn it sideways, go this way. Nice colors. If I go sideways and think about your web page, and then I carve off a square, and I carve off a square. So the square I'm carving off on the side here. And I take this and I carve off a square. That's where your eye is going to get drawn. And if you think of photography, when they talk about rule of thirds, they talk about carving what you see through the viewfinder into thirds and positioning the most interesting part at the intersections, which is a lot of scribbles behind a basic premise. You kind of can divide things into thirds, roughly. And when you break things into thirds like that and don't position something dead center, but position it into the third, into the quadrant you want, it won't guarantee a good design, but it will steer you away from a bad design. Now, yeah.
Why
Why isn't it centered?
Yeah.
Not really a stupid question. It's an interesting aesthetic. The psychology of the human brain sees something centered as not centered. And so you tend to think that if something is dead center, that there's something wrong with it. And I couldn't tell you the exact psychology behind it. The way it was explained to me is that human beings evolved over centuries to recognize that the things that are the most beautiful are purely symmetrical. In particular, think human faces. And because that's so very, very rare, we're used to seeing things that are asymmetrical. And so we tend to gravitate towards the things we see the most. Now that's probably a weak excuse for why this kind of works. The good news for this is, after we get past a little bit of the CSS stuff, there are people who have pre-calculated all the sizes to make these golden rectangles work in the web. And they're called grid systems. And I will show you how they kind of fit together. I'll dig out some websites that describe it in a better way.
Thank you.
So it's one of those kind of fascinating psychology things that as you get into computer science, you didn't think you'd ever have to know anything about. Right? It's part and parcel with what we call human factors engineering. So if I'm building an application, some of the things we've seen through experimentation and research is that if somebody's using a pull down, for instance, a pull down widget that has a list of things in it, if it's got more than 7 items in it, they don't look at it. So don't put more than 7 items in a pull down. People memorize things by position. They don't actually read the words. So if you have an OK button and a cancel button, think about how many times you read the words OK and cancel versus just reaching for the right spot on the screen. It's why when you arrange your icons on the desktop, you get really upset when someone rearranges your icons. Because you remember where they are positionally. You're not reading the titles underneath them. So that if that fascinates you, that topic is called human factors engineering. And there's a lot of really large companies that have entire human factors labs full of designers, engineers, programmers that do research into this topic. We do eye tracking, and we do this on the game development side too. Just like the camera is watching me now, we can have the camera run some software and track what my eyes are looking at on the screen. And I'll dig some information out and on the break. Some of it's just really fascinating stuff that has nothing to do with building web pages, just kind of really cool, fascinating stuff. All right. To get back to drawing boxes, I typically want to lay out the boxes with a couple kind of special considerations. So for me, the first thing is I want to know how much of my page is visible at any one time. Is it the whole page or just part of the page? So let's say it's just part of the page. I want to orchestrate it so that my page flows. This part we call above the fold. And the analogy here is if you had a newspaper. Newspapers typically are folded in the middle. And the front page, what people see, the headlines, the first photo, the things that are hooks that drag you into a newspaper back in the day are the things that are above the fold. And everything we do on the computer was done by a person, which means that person had to relate it back to something they know or we all know. That's why our computers have files and folders, not some strange system for managing stuff on it. When we talk about web pages, they're predominantly modeled after documents. And sometimes those documents get big, and we want to present that information to people where the most important stuff is in their face first, the stuff above the fold. It also stems from that human factors part. People don't like scrolling. So an absolute that we found is that people do not scroll right to left. They just don't do it. So if your page is too wide and it forces somebody to scroll right to left, you can assume that they will never scroll to the far right-hand side and see what's there. So you might as well make your page so it just fits. Top to bottom, you can go longer. People will scroll vertically. But the very first thing they see, their first impression, is what's going to dictate whether or not they're going to spend more time there and whether they're going to scroll further. So as we relate that back to the design of our pages, we're going to think about, hey, is this whole thing fit on one page? Or if it's bigger than one page, where do I put the break? Where do I set it up so that if you just see the top part, what would it be? And that'll help us dictate the size of things, the width and height of things. How big do I make my header? Do I need a navigation menu? Do I want things to stick to the top of the page? How do those things interact with each other? And if all of these things sound relatively complicated, the implementation part is not the hard part. The implementation part follows, what do you want to do? And that means we got to draw and design a plan. So for the next assignment, I asked you to start putting together a biography of yourself. Right? And in that assignment, you're going to build a page, and I want you to share with me the diagram that you use as your plan. Now, your plan doesn't need to be a multi-page document. It doesn't need to be anything elaborate. In fact, for most people, what I offer them is draw it on paper, take a photo of it with your phone, and send me a PDF of that photo. If you want to do it in some application that you find easy to draw stuff in, go ahead. Just spit out a PDF, attach it to Moodle. Okay. But the idea here is you start with a plan. And from that plan, we're going to draw some boxes, and we're going to make sure that our content fits inside the boxes, and it's going to give us an idea of how big we want to make content. Are we going to restrict the width of things? Well, in my cats page, I probably am. When I come down to figuring out how big these things are, right? I probably want that image to be a third of the width of the screen. So today we're going to get into how do we do that? Because you can absolutely make that happen. And there's no less than 4 different ways to do it. And that's where we start to get into the creativity behind building these kinds of pages. Because there's multiple ways to do these things, it's not like one is more right than the other. It depends on how you want to structure it. It depends on how you want things to interact with each other. Every document is, to a certain extent, unique. And our main problem is typically that our users have some control over what's going on. You know, a user can resize your browser at any time. If you were to look at the behind the scenes behind my screens right now, you absolutely will find that nothing is ever maximized. Nothing ever consumes the whole screen. And part of that is because the whole point for me of having windows is so I can have multiple things I can get to all at once. I can click on the corner of something that's peeking out from behind something and quickly bring it to the front. Or I can pull things side by side, so if I'm writing some code and want to see the result instantly, I can. without having to flip screens. What it also means is as you're designing pages, you have to take into account to a certain extent, users can absolutely resize things. And to do that, we're going to have to allow for certain parts of our page to deal with that. And usually we do that by making the main containers that everything's in some sort of variable width. And by variable, I mean we're going to use some units that can change as you change the size of the browser. And let the browser do its thing. When you change the size of the browser, it recalculates certain sizes, certain styles, and when it recalculates those styles, it relays out and redraws the whole page. And it does that all automatically without you doing anything. So at that point, we need to get into the fact that we're going to style some things and we're going to give some size to things, which means we need to use units of measurement. And I have listed here the main units of measurement that we use within our web applications and web pages. And each of them has their strengths and weaknesses. We can use percentages. If I want something to be a third of the size of the page, I can set its width to be 33%. It's literally 1/3 of the size of the page, regardless of how wide the browser is. The upside of percentages is they change as you change the size of the browser. The downside is most of my screens are 1920 by 1080, and at 1920 pixels wide, 1% is 19 pixels. And that's a really large step every time you want to kind of move something around. So it's highly inaccurate, but very flexible. On the opposite end of the spectrum, I'm a game developer, and sometimes we build games in the web. In order to make those work everywhere, we typically carve out a box. In this case, we do put it in the center, and we'll make that box very much smaller than typical screen resolution. And everything inside that box, we will control very specifically, pixel by pixel. Every pixel, every little dot on the screen, we control directly. And in the web, you can use pixels as an absolute measurement. The other one that's very, very helpful are EM units you'll see all over the place in the web. And EM units are a single unit of typography, and sometimes they're hard to wrap your head around. EM units are variable in that they're a multiple of the current font size. So if you use a style to set the font size to a certain number of pixels, that's the height of a single character. That becomes one EM unit in that div and every child div inside it until you change it again. Now that's very, very handy if you're doing a lot of font work. If you're doing a lot of font work, if one EM unit is the size of a character, then if you want a 1.5 line spacing above and a half line below, then you make the padding above 1.5 EM units and the padding below 0.5 EM units. And that way, whenever you resize things, like resize the font size, those EM units just mathematically do the right thing. And you get the same ratio. And finally, when we start talking about overall widths and heights of things, we'll often use a unit called a virtual width or virtual height unit. Now, these are very closely related to percentage units, but the virtual height, virtual width units are based on the size of the browser at the current time. Now, I would recommend you use these instead of percentages. They can be used in the same way. They're numbers from 0 to 100. So that 0 is obviously no height or no width, and 100 is 100% of the width of the browser. Okay. Percentage units are a percentage of the parent div, where we build our sites out of divs, and divs can be nested inside divs, the inner div being the child div and the outer div being the parent div. Percentage units are percentage of your parent, whereas virtual width, virtual height units are percentage of the current width of the browser, height of the browser. Now, as things go, the default rules for how things flow is kind of important to have a good grasp on. And the default way things flow is that all divs float as far left and up as possible. This is the default, what we call block level orientation. And we can override this, but that's the default. Unless you specify the width of something, it will consume the full width of the browser. So the content might be smaller, and the actual div might be smaller, but nothing will go beside it when you're using that block level orientation. They stack top to bottom. Spans stack side to side, left to right. Now that's all going to change in a moment because the default block orientation is something that we often override very quickly in our web pages. More often than not, we want our divs to flow left to right based on the size of them, not take up the full width of the browser. We want a div to show up with another div beside it. And the way we do that is we change one of the styles on parents. Okay. All of those styles get loaded as the browser loads your page. So as it loads the head section, it has an opportunity to import styles from an external source, an external file. And these are what we call style sheets. They're a separate file filled with CSS styles. We can then load styles from a style tag in the head section. And after we've loaded those, we can then attach styles that are attached to the style attribute in the individual HTML elements. At the end of the day, the styles attached to the HTML elements are the least efficient way to do things. They don't allow you to reuse things, and they become very, very tied to the HTML. And part of the whole idea of separating the CSS from the HTML is to decouple them. It gives us the ability to change the look of something without having to change all the HTML. So, as a reminder, we're going to get into how the styles actually work, but we're going to write all of our HTML attributes in lowercase. We're going to enclose all of our attribute parameters or attribute values in double quotes. And the common attributes that we talked about last time that every HTML element has are classes, IDs, titles, and styles. Now I'm going to come back to titles because they have a very specific use inside an HTML element. And starting from the bottom up, the style attribute lets us attach styles to a very specific element on our page. In this case, the specific div that I'm working with. IDs let us give a unique ID to any individual div. And to tell the truth, for most parts, if you're just doing the HTML and CSS, the IDs are there for you to help you. When you start adding JavaScript, the IDs become much more important because they're the way JavaScript identifies an element to modify. And the classes are a way for us to connect a bunch of styles together and group them and select which groups of CSS styles we want to apply collectively to a particular element. We're going to do a little bit of each of those. Now, every style is what we call a name-value pair, or a style name, and that style has a value. And those styles always come in an attribute value or a name value pair. And the pair is always separated by a colon and is finished or terminated by a semicolon. So in this case, I'm setting all of the margins, all 4 of them, to 5 pixels wide. Each style gets added to the list of styles attached to a particular div. Now, I'm going to share on my screen, we're going to start up my All About Cats page, and we're going to take a look at it in the debugger, in the inspector. So give me a second here. Get that going. There we go, All About Cats. Remember All About Cats? And now I get my inspector for All About Cats. And for each thing here, I can see that for this div, I have a number of styles that I've overridden. I can also see the box for the box model. And if I pull myself out of the way, I'm going to blow this guy up and put him bigger so you can see it. So the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to hit the menu here, and I'm going to pop this out as a separate window. And then I'm going to share that window with you guys. So this is the same debugger attached to the same page. There we go. So we have our box model, margins, borders, paddings, and size of content. Tells you exactly how big it is. It's 1495 pixels calculated by 55 pixels tall. And I have no paddings, no border, no margins attached to this div. If I look at the styles that I've overridden, you can see the two of them here. And this says user agent style sheet. So that's attached in the HTML page. If we look at computed, this will give us all of the styles attached to that div. And we can see them all here. Right. All of them there. Get that a little smaller. So this is the complete and full list of every style you can modify. Attribute, value, attribute, value. Every last one of them. All the ones that are in the darker color are the defaults. The ones that are bright are ones I've overridden. So you can see the number of things we can modify here. Now, no one expects anyone to memorize these styles or what they do. We have cheat sheets and we have the W3 Schools CSS reference if we need to look up how to do something. And if it's something that we do all day, every day, like changing margins and borders, you get used to doing the same things, and so you kind of memorize the ones you use all the time. But don't ever be afraid to look something up online. How do I make list items so that they don't have bullets? How do I make this anchor reference not have a blue underline under it? Right. How do I change the way it looks? So look, its color is set to blue. That's a typical link. And it has a pointer cursor. Oh, there's a cursor attribute. When I move the pointer on top of it, it changes cursor. Can't even see the cursor. Move the pointer on top of it, I get my cursor changing. So we can use this information to kind of look up all the possible values. What's more, if we use a programming editor like Visual Studio Code, we can also tie into its ability to know what are all the possible values when we're writing stuff. So every style has this same format. It has a name, a colon, and a value. We can attach any style with the style attribute to an HTML element directly. And when we start playing with the main styles that affect divs, we're usually talking about this set of styles. Margins, padding, and border you've seen before. The display style has a bunch of settings, and they dictate how the boxes or how the divs are related to each other. And I'll give you some diagrams on that in a bit. The display element tells us whether things line up top to bottom, left to right, or whether they flow upper left to bottom right, depending on their size. We can override the width and the height of something. While the browser is going to compute it, we can set the width and we can set the height. And the browser will respect that, and it will try and wrap our content within those things. We can also tell it whether or not the information in the box is to overflow the box and spill out the bottom so that we see it regardless, or we can hide that information. We can have that box be like a window into the information. And we can also dictate the positioning of the box relative to its parent. How far from the top or the left or the right or the bottom is this box? And for a bunch of these, there are variations on them. And the variations include the position of them. So margin dash top only affects the top margin. And border dash right is only the right border. And padding dot bottom is only the bottom padding. A lot of times what we will do is we will declare a style like a padding of 5 pixels, but I want a little bit more at the top, so then I'll say padding top is 8 pixels, or 0.5 EM units. So as we think about all of these kinds of elements, we're going to take a short break for 10 minutes here. I'll come back at 5 to 10, and we're going to start to put these into practice in our All About Cats page. And then we're going to start a brand new page, which is going to be the starting point for your biography based on the diagrams you've done. Right? All right. So I'll come back at 10 o'clock. All right?
Thank you. Thank you.
Right. I've had more coffee now. Better. So there's a couple pieces that we need to start building our biographies, and we're going to kind of cobble them together out of stuff we've already done. I added the live share link to the text chat, so if you want to click on that link, you can see what I'm doing in the live share. I'm also going to show on the screen behind me the results of it. So between the two of them, you should be able to see what's actually going on here. Now, what we've actually set up to do is to be able to build an entire page based on what we know about that box model. And if we just kind of like plant that picture in our heads. The typical styling elements we're going to attach to different things in our biography are going to be these things. Margin and padding, which you can set numerically the size of them. And you can set individually the top, bottom, left, and right, or you can set them globally, all the margin on this div. Border has the following format. You're going to specify whether it's solid or dashed, and then you're going to specify its width, and that's a certain size, and then its color. And for colors, you know, the standard default colors, you can just type the names of the colors, and the browser knows how to interpret that into the right absolute value. If you want a very specific color, you can specify it. You just have to use a hexadecimal number. And I can pull that offline at the end of today if you guys want to get into how you figure out hexadecimal numbers for specific colors. You can also use a CSS function. We'll get into that when we're inside our CSS files. As well as the border, there's an outline attribute. Pardon me. And the outline attribute goes outside of the margin. So you can put a border around both sides. You can display the... Yeah?
All those attributes have to be inside the tab of style?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. It makes it really long, right?
Yeah.
And really ugly. Yeah.
Yeah, really.
We'll make it better. Trust me, we'll make it better. Okay. The display attribute is actually got 4 different settings, but the default 2 settings are inline and block. Inline being left to right, block being top to bottom. There is an inline dash block that does both, which is commonly used. And it means divs will fill the page from left to right as long as they fit in the page width. If you have 2 divs, one 40% of the page width, another one 45% of the page width, they'll both fit side by side. And the next div will drop down below them. But if you have one div that's 65% of the page width and another div that's 60% of the page width, the first one will show up and the second one will drop down below it because there isn't enough room for 120% of the page width. The tricky part with those inline block displays is that the margins and the padding are not included in the values, so they have to be accounted for. In other words, if you decide to create a div that's 50% of the width, adding the margin and the border, particularly the margin on top of that, could make it actually larger than 50%. So if you make 2 divs 50% width, and then you add a margin on one of them, they won't fit on the same level. One will flop down below. Because the one with the margin on it, on the outside, will make it bigger than 50%. I'll demonstrate that, make it. You can also specify which way things float. And that is, if there's space and something isn't the full width of your browser, does it float to the left, which is the default, or does it float to the right, which you can change? And once you start floating everything to the right, that doesn't stop until you clear the floats. There's also 4 very important settings we can put for the position style. And the position, static, fixed, relative, and absolute tell us how divs relate to their parents. A statically positioned div gets stuck to the browser, and a fixed position div gets stuck to the page. Now, those don't seem to make a lot of sense until you actually start using them. One of them scrolls with the page, and you can scroll it off the page, but it stays at the same position on the page, as if your browser were a window into the page moving behind your browser. If your browser's here, and you build a page. The other one that I have there is Z-index. Your browser is not flat. Your browser is exactly like Photoshop. It has layers. 0 is the farthest to the back you can go. There are no units on it. There is no maximum on it. So you could put something at position 0, something at position 50, something at position 5,000. The 5,000 position Z-index is going to be in front of the thing at 50 as a Z-index. So you can layer things in the browser to make them look nice. Now, if I flip back to the positioning for a second, and like I said, we'll give you an idea of this, it's a little bit easier to visualize this way. Static positioning is stuck to the page. So your browser's a window, the page is behind it, you're looking through the browser at your page. Static positioning means that the things that you position statically are stuck to the page, and as you scroll the page, they stay where they were. Relative positioning means that the div is positioned relative to its parents, which means you can set offsets. You can say, hey, I want to be 15 pixels to the left and positioned relative, and then create a div that's a parent div. Now the parent div can have its own positioning. And this is where things start to become a little bit of div soup. And if you open up another page in the inspector that's on some big commercial site, you'll find nested divs forever. And this is part of why. Absolute positioning is relative to the parent. There are a couple exceptions. Generally speaking, it's relative to the corner of the browser. And the upper left is 0, 0. So as you can see in the diagram, the absolute left position is going to position some element relative to the corner of the browser. Now, fixed position does something similar, but it does it relative to the browser window and has nothing to do with any parent or child divs. So a couple of the tricks we use with this CSS position. First of all, we'll play around with fixed position elements for things like headers and footers that we want stuck to the top and the bottom of the browser and let the page roll behind it. Second is we'll use relative position, which is the default for almost all elements. But sometimes we'll create a static element or an absolute positioned element inside a relative element to be able to shift something or move something in the exact dimensions we want. So we can have something that's relative positioned and then something that's absolutely positioned inside it. And the absolute positioning is relative to its parent. I also mentioned something about floating things to the left and to the right. Allow us to make divs that aren't the full width of our browser drift one way or the other. And you have to clear that float if you want to switch directions, so to speak. So when you're putting together your design for your pages, some of the things you need to consider are which way do you want things to float? Do you want to have a very static layout? Do you want to have things glued to the top and the bottom of the browser? Let's try and put a few of those things into practice, okay? We're going to do that by starting up a new page, a bio page. So I'm going to go to my editor. I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call this bio version 1. And inside there, I'm going to create a new file, index.html. Now, part of the reason I left my all about cats out is realistically, I have been writing this stuff from scratch every single time, but real developers don't do that. Like I said, most developers are pretty lazy. So how do we actually do that? What we actually do is we go to a previous project and we take the parts that are common and we copy and paste them. And it's not all about cats, so the first thing I'm going to do is change the title. And then I'm going to close up the tags here so we have a proper structure. There's a head tag, it's got a body, and we got to close the HTML tag and set our indentation. So now we have a brand new page. Now we're going to test a few things out. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to build a div that at some point is going to be my header and also my footer. And I'm going to add a couple things into my HTML style. Right? So I've got the right font size. The default color is going to be white on this page. The background color I'm going to set to be, let's pick, dark slate gray sounds good. And I keep missing it. It's got both the American and the Canadian.
Are there only a limited number of like word colors, like a word color palette, or can you put in like a hex code or something like
You can put in a hex code. There's two ways to do it. The first and easiest way, you can use a red, green, blue, and you can give it numbers between 0 and 255. What color does that kind of shows you in the editor?
White.
Right. And so anything where the red, it's red, green, blue in that order. Okay. If you want to get fancy, there's a separate one for alpha. And the alpha value is between 0 and 1. As in 0 to 100%. So I can come in here and go, anytime I use all three that are the same, I'm going to get a gray. So that's kind of a dark gray with 50% alpha. Okay. I use the predefined colors because it's a little easier. Visual Studio Code, See this cool little pop-up? So if you don't know, you can kind of go in here. You should be able to just pick whatever color you like. Got a color picker. Kind of change the tone. You can change the alpha, and it just fits the values in for you. So that's kind of cool.
Where do you find the picker in that little block?
Yeah, if you just hover over the RGBA function, it pops up the little.
Thank you.
Right. Let's go full dark. There we go. Now I'm going to go take a look at what that looks like. There's my V2. No. That's not very exciting. It's not incorrect, it's just doing exactly what I told it to do. There's no content here. It says Bio V1 because that's the title that I have. Kind of boring. Let's do it here. That way you can see in both places. I've got the live share running so you can see it more clearly rather than looking at it on the screen, which is probably pretty small and pretty blurry and hard to read. In a sec, I'll flip over and show you the browser output, but right now the browser output is a gray screen. So let's put some content in there. I'm going to create another div here for my main content. And we'll fill that in. Now in the header, I've got some content. And now I can flip these around for you. And you can start to see what it's outputting. So what else am I going to add there? Well, let's start with a navigation bar. And what did we talk about previous day? For that navigation bar, that menu bar, I'm going to use an unordered list. And what things do I want? Work stuff, school stuff. Sure, let's do this. So that gives me a menu, and you can see on my screen, if you're watching the live share and then you're looking at my screen, you can see what it's kind of generating there. Okay. I'm going to have some main content. And I'm going to put some extra space in just so I can see it. I'm going to do something fancy here. I'm going to make the main content have a different color background. Let's do this. Now, you notice in my browser, it hasn't changed, even though I set the background color. And it hasn't changed because my main div doesn't have any content in it, so it doesn't have any size. Here's the body. There's my header. There's my menu bar. And here's my main div. Right here. And it says it has size of 0 in height. So let's just override that manually with a style. Let's make it 20 EM units. I'll make it 5 so you can see it. So now that I give it a proper height, I can see it. And inside there, we can play around with some positioning. We'll make a red box. And background color red. But we also need to give it some size. Now, in this case, there are 2 special HTML attributes for width and height, so you don't have to put them in a style element. Either work. See if we get that. Is that going to help us? Put it inside the style and see how different it is.
Why is the height of the gray box and in inch and this one in pixels?
Change my mind?
Okay, so it doesn't matter.
No. They're all interchangeable. There's my little box. Now, if I want to shift that box over a little bit, I can do a bunch of things with it. So let's make the box a little bigger so you can see it. And what I'm going to do in the style for this thing is I'm going to shift it. And I can shift it with a bunch of different ways. First of all, I can shift it by putting a margin around it. I could shift it by just specifying how far from the left side it is. And you see, it doesn't really change too much. So this is kind of like a really hard way to play around with this. What I've got in here now, you see I've got it position fixed, and I don't have a big enough area that it's going to scroll. So let's just make this height 20. So it's really big, so I can scroll it. You see the fixed part means when I scroll it, it doesn't move. Static, it moves with the page. And the other thing we're going to play with here is inside this main block. Make this display inline block. Okay. You notice what changed there. As a block display item, it fills the width. The div is a block level element, it fills the width of the browser. As soon as I made it inline block, it now only is as wide as the content inside it, which is my little red square. So if I want something that's display inline block and I want it to be the full width of the page, I have to tell it the full width of the page. And the best way to tell it the full width of the page is to use those VW units. Now you'll also notice when I do that, it stretches beyond the width of the page. I've got a scroll bar on the bottom there now. So what's going on there? Well, what's going on there is that the main part is 100% of the width of the browser. But it has some other elements on it beyond that in the whole page. So we might have to scale that back a bit, and you can either do this experimentally, make it 98%, still not enough, or we can take a look at that div here in the debugger and see at what point does the scroll bar side to side go away. And the size here is based on how much space do I have. So there's something you can see when I click on the body, it's got an outer orange boundary around it. That padding around it, that default margin of 8 pixels on the body, is affecting the width of our main container. So our main container is whatever the virtual width is, plus 8 pixels on each side. Now, if you're following so far, you'll look at my styles and you'll go, wow, that's really ugly, Scott. And you're right, it's really, really ugly. In fact, writing styles like this is really nice for doing a one-off override if you're testing something, but it's not really the way we want to do this. So let's take a quick look at how we actually put styles together in a nice, easy to modify, easy to work with way. And that's where we start talking about what we call the cascade. And this is how do all the styles get applied to all the different elements on your page. There's a hierarchy towards this, and that CSS gets applied top to bottom. In other words, we read the cascading style sheets and the style tags and the style attributes in specific order. So when your browser reads the HTML, it creates a document structure, and it uses that structure to connect the cascading style sheet information to specific elements in your browser. So we read it from external files first, and those are declared in the head section. We're going to do one of those in a sec. We're going to link in a new cascading style sheet. We then will take a look to see if the head section has a style tag, and we'll apply styles that are in that style tag. And then finally, we'll find style attributes in specific divs, and we'll apply them. And they happen in sequence. In other words, the order in which they happen in the HTML file is the order in which they get applied to the rest of the elements in the body section. If two different locations change a style on the same element, the last one in wins. The last one to change it wins. So you typically will lay these things out from most generic to most specific. Now the browser also has a default style sheet that's hidden from you, and that's what gives everything their default styles. And we'll add our own user-defined style sheets and potentially page-specific styles in a style tag. And we'll try and avoid using those style attributes on the HTML elements. How do we find out which styles to apply to which elements? That is done through the use of what we call a selector. Now, selectors are ways of grouping styles together. And when they group styles together, they group them together with a search term. There are three kind of levels of selectors you can pick. And there's a lot of variations on them, but let's just keep it straightforward. You can make selectors that pick off a specific tag. In the example I have here, all divs get the styles that are inside the curly brackets here. The second selector I have here is prefixed by a period, and that's a class style selector. And that is going to go look for all elements that have a class attribute with a name that matches. If the name myClass is in a class attribute for an element, then all the styles inside myClass get applied to that element. And finally, if you need to style a very specific ID, you can use a number sign or a hashtag to identify which specific ID you want to attach some styles to. Now, the last one is kind of frowned upon. It's kind of the kludge or the when no other thing will work way to do things. So try and do things with classes, right? Each selector defines a collection of styles, and those collections of styles get applied to your HTML as the page loads. Every style is one of those attribute value pairs, and we're going to put them inside the curly braces to define that group of styles that go to a selector. Now, what's going to happen is we're going to load them from a separate location. So let's go back and look at our bio page where I've got a whole mess of stuff going on. And when I look at the code inside the live share, you'll see that my main has a huge collection of styles, and my red box has a bunch of styles, and they're really kind of messy. So at this point, we can introduce a new tag, and this tag goes in the head section. The tag is called a link. We want to link in another file. Okay. We want to relate this thing as a style sheet. And we're going to tell the browser what kind of file it is. Type. This is a CSS file. And where is it? We haven't created it yet, but I can tell you where we're going to create it. This is the de facto standard file name for styles. So in our Visual Studio Code, we're going to go over to the file browser part here, collapse up some of this unused stuff. And what we're going to do is we're going to, in our bio folder, create a new folder inside there called CSS. And inside that CSS folder, we're going to create a new file called style.css. And inside here, we're going to put our style information. And the way we're going to do it is, first we're going to put our name in it. And we're going to use comments the way CSS does comments. /*//. And now we're going to choose some selectors. The first selector I have is on the HTML tag. I want this to be for everything. So on everything inside the HTML tag, I want the following styles. And here I can just cut and paste. And when we define these in a separate file, we'll break them apart by semicolons. Easier to read. Now we got to link these two things together, which means we're going to remove the style attribute out of the HTML tag, and we're going to replace it with nothing at all. How come that works? Well, when the browser loads this style sheet, it looks for all HTML tags and applies these styles to all HTML tags. So we're going to go ahead and do that with a couple of the other things here, and we're going to try and make some intelligent choices about what we have here. So one of the styles I'm going to create here is I'm going to create a box. And in this box, I'm going to change a few things here. I'm going to make the width and the height part of the box style. And then I'm going to take them out of this. Let's do this way. I want you to be able to see those things going on at the same time. Now I can take width and height out of here, and by adding class box, I should get my red square back. Now I can carry this on with some basic styles. The idea here is that anything that you think is reusable, you pull apart into a separate selector. And you can name the selectors what you want, all lowercase because they got to be used in the HTML. Yep. Go ahead.
Why in the CSS, why did you use dot to create the red and the box class? No, there's no dot in the HTML.
So the dot in the selector name tells the CSS interpreter that you should go look for things in the class attribute in the HTML to match these. So nothing in front of it, it's a tag. A dot in front of it, look for class.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and we can also do this. Now, if you have multiple classes you want to apply, just separate them with a space. So if you look at the live share and start top to bottom, the browser loads the HTML, gives us some structure, some scaffolding to hang things off of. Then it gets to this main div that has a style for the background color and the display type inline block. Plus, the style.css file defines that the thing with the ID called main, that's this guy, should have these additional styles attached to it, height and width. The next element is my red box. And my red box has two classes attached to it, the box class, then the red class. And the box class means it attaches these styles, and then the red class means it attaches these styles. And then I set the position static and left 3em. But what happens if I make this So why is it blue? It has the red class on it. And the answer shows up in that inspector. Here's my red box. And the styles you'll see in this inspector, you can go from bottom to top. So the top elements are the last things added, and they can override anything that exists before. It says that from style.css, we add the HTML styles, because they get applied to everything and all child underneath. And then we have the default div, that's user agent style sheet, those are the defaults. And then we have our red class applied, because it's got the red name in the class list. So that makes it red. And then we have the box class applied, and you can see the order in which they happen in, right? And the box gives us some size, and then I have a style attribute which overrides some things. And one of the things it overrides is the color, and you can see it stroked out here. It says, nope, this has been overridden by this. So you can build styles that have a default style and then do custom one-off stuff, either with the style attribute or with an ID tag. If you look at main, you'll also see I've got the HTML styles applied, and then I've got the default applied, and then I've got my main classes applied, and it tells you which file it is and what line in the file. On line 15 of style.css is where main is defined. And then I have a style attribute on the HTML element that overrides the background color and the display. So we can mess around with these to get the look we want. Now's probably a good time for you to sit down and start with your bio and think about your biography. Put some time into doing a diagram. I'm going to give you about 15 minutes till about 11 o'clock. I'm going to stay here. If you have questions, please ask. But after you design it on paper, start to build the HTML for it. It's just going to be a few boxes to start with. You may need to wrap some of your divs with other divs in order to position things. So if you want two boxes side by side, you may need to wrap them in a parent div or a parent box so that the two things can be defined as inline block, whereas the parent is a block element. So you can kind of put things together this way. Now, in the meantime, I'm going to take my custom styles out and kind of distill them down into the key things that I'm going to need.
I don't know why, whenever I try to put like in the CSS one, the style one, whenever I put like the color and then I type in white, but it like the little box won't show up.
In Visual Studio Code?
Yeah.
Is there a special plugin for that? I don't think there is.
There it is. Look. See, I don't have like the little box. Like I have it on the other one. But then I have it on this one. See, it's like white and it has.
Yep.
Like even
which one is mine and which one is yours?
I don't know. This one is mine. This one is yours.
So yours works and mine doesn't.
No, yours works, not mine.
Oh. Well, that sucks. You want it the other way around.
Exactly.
There isn't a special plugin for it. It's just out of the box.
Should I just like leave it white?
It'll still work.
Okay.
Let me take a look at it a little bit closer, Sophia. I'd love to follow.
See it?
Yep. So Right. So here's the thing. That copyright notice that's there is using HTML comments. So everything after that line is ignored. It's not the right syntax. In the style.css file, we're going to use different symbols to tell it it's a comment.
Okay.
So try that. It's a /*.
Can you put in the CSS one?
Yeah.
On yours? Please.
Can you see it on mine?
Yes, I can. Yes, I can.
It's these.
I think it's fixed. Yeah, I got it. Thank you.
Okay. For those that are interested, those are actually the way comments are done in C and C++. You're now programmers. So let me fix these up.
Hey, Scott.
Yep.
Theoretically, when we're doing style elements, should we always be doing the style elements in the CSS, like .css folder and applying the styles to everything? Like, we shouldn't be doing a mix, right?
It's okay to do a mix. What I suggest is migrate things. So like the one I just did, this class gray, I might do a style tag because I can put these here as well. So the selector was gray, and then I've got my background gray, and I put it in a style tag. They happen in sequence. External file first, because it's first in the file, then the style tag, and then what's in the style attribute, which is no longer gray. Okay? And then I go look at it, and once it works, which it isn't right now, but once it works, then what I'll do is I will actually cut it out of here and put it in the style sheet there. And you'll slowly build up this style sheet. Eventually, what you do is you end up building multiple style sheets. This file, this style.css, is a style sheet, and you can apply multiple of them, just list them. And I usually have two. I usually have a base style or style base. You know, as you're doing lots of applications, you find there's some things you're doing over and over and over and over again. So those things that are not application specific, but I just do in every web page, I tend to migrate into that style base file. And then when I start a new project, the first thing I do is link my style base in.
Right, okay.
Right? And then I have a style.css that's specific to that page.
Yeah, it just feels like it could get really cluttered sometimes with adding styles and the HTML.
Yeah. When I go to publish it, I usually take that out.
I ask too how to do an inline block kind of thing with a text div and an image all in the same
Yes.
page.
Yes. Let me pull some of these styles out, and then I'll kind of do it. Okay? So one of the things I'm going to do here is I'm going to take that inline block bit out of there, and I'm going to apply it everywhere. There we go. I'm going to take my static positioning and all that stuff out, just demo stuff. So let's, inside the red box, actually let's just leave the red box alone. So let's create a div, and I'm going to move this to another tab. I'm not going to go look at it till I need it. I'm going to create a little container, and inside the container I might have an image, right? And where am I going to put my images? Well, I'm going to create a separate folder for them. So either images or sometimes assets. And let's just grab this. So there's my image. And then I'm going to have right. Now, because everything has got the inline block style on it now, and it's going to give me a little bit of a mess here, I'm going to make the font size smaller so that they fit side by side. Because if I look at them, I can see the image and then I can see the location. So let me go grab an actual image from my thing. So under Bio V1, I'm going to come in here. I'll close it. I'm going to come in here, create yet another folder called Assets. And inside there, I'm going to go grab from my machine, see if I can, a couple images. Good. So there's my Anuvik photo. Because I like going to travel to really remote places. And the content beneath it. And I'm going to remove the debugger here so we can see what happens. So you can see it's one below the other. Right? And if we look, the inspector gets really problematic here. Let's do this. So if you look at it in the inspector, the container has a size, and the size is kind of the width of the image, right? And the size of the next div, you can see when you look at, I highlight them. So I'm highlighting them in the inspector. You see how this thing is the full width of the page?
Yeah.
So it won't fit beside the image. So the trick here is, well, how do I make it fit? Well, I have to specify that it's not allowed to be the full width. Right. So I can try and do that a couple ways. One of the ways I can do it is I can make this span, because that's an inline element. That's kind of the easiest way. And if you look at the inspector now, what you see is my container, and inside my container I have the image and then a span, and the span's default display is inline block. See this container? It has a div says display block.
Yeah.
And that's overriding my inline block. Right. The other way to do it is we can go back to style.css. And we can start to apply some default styles to all divs. Now when I look at my page, I don't have to make it a span anymore.
Okay.
Because all divs now have that inline block style. And you'll also notice that the red thing is down here now.
Yeah.
Right?
Is that because it's in order in the style sheet?
Right. And also here's the red box. If you look at it in the live share.
Yeah.
So the red box, then I've got this container, and the container has an image and the div, and the size of those two things doesn't take up the full width of the browser. If I highlight them in the inspector, you can see that the red box is 40 pixels. The image, what's it say? the image is 480 pixels and the div is 47. So if I were to do some quick math, that's about 700 pixels wide, and my browser's wider than that right now.
And that spacing in between them is just auto. Like
right.
What?
Right. It's the default padding, I think, if you add.
So what's the difference between? So padding would be the space between elements, and the margin would be the space between the edges.
Yeah, let's put this on all divs so that we can see it. Let's put a border. Of a dashed red pixel. And now let's make it yellow. Sure. Now you can see where all the divs are. Right? So let's add to every single div a padding of, let's just say 10 pixels. And see what happened to them all?
Yes.
Relative to the yellow line? Okay, let's change padding to margin. Now you see what happened?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, let's go really crazy. Let's just add the margin on the top. Okay. And you can do that with padding as well. One of the things I often do create a debug class. I like red. I like red because my eye can kind of tune it out if I want to. But now that I have that debug class, I can go back here and anything I'm not sure where this really is and it's not looking the way I want. I can just add that debug class. To a bunch of things. And I can see the boxes around the divs. And if I want to make them bigger so I can see them, I'll make them fatter. And if I want to go super crazy, remember I had that outline style?
Yeah.
Now let's go. Okay, you can't even see the green one. Okay, so let's just back them off a little bit. And now, when I'm playing with these things, what happens if I put in a padding of 0.25 EMs and a border, margin.
Where you put that padding in though, does text automatically have a little bit of padding on the top and the bottom?
Only to deal with the font kerning. Okay.
Is the bottom of the image also had a little bit of padding too?
Yeah. Yeah. At the bottom of the image, what you see with the padding, the sometimes I travel to remote locations text. Right.
Down with it.
Yeah, so you see how the sometimes I travel with remote locations, because of the padding and margin on that, they make the container bigger. And the image is positioned in the upper left portion of the container.
Text just overrides it because it has that function.
Yeah, the text stretches it.
Yeah.
So the text itself you just highlight it with your mouse. It'll show you, okay, there's a little bit of space around there. That's part of the font. All right. And then from the part that's highlighted in blue to the red dashed line, that's my padding. And that padding, you can see, drops down below the ledger line for the font. So the image is stuck to the upper left. The baseline of the font is supposed to line up with the baseline of the image, and the padding makes the div that the font is in a little bit bigger than that. And so the container, the bigger box here, has to stretch to accommodate both of these. Width-wise, they all fit. But height-wise, they have to accommodate this, plus the padding down below, plus the margin below that. The margin is outside of the outline and the border.
I ask like a crazy question.
There are no crazy questions.
Is it a way to make a border so it wraps around the very edge of the bottom pixel of the image and then goes through following with the text as well?
So you want a border on just the bottom of the image?
Yeah, and then that border would keep, you know what I mean? That would be the border, the bottommost border.
Let's try it. Let's take our image tag and attach some styles to it. Let's go border, bottom. That's okay. I'm just going with some crazy suggestions. We can back up and walk through some stuff if you want. So let's do just so we can kind of see it. And then let's take the debug thing off. So I do have a black line there. Let's make it fat so you can see it. See the big black line on the bottom there?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, if I want to do that on the text here as well, let's create this. Let's do it this way. I got a bug. Stop it. So now I get those two fat lines. Okay. So now I have to deal with the fact that I can see that the font, I'll scroll it up for you. So I can see that the font, the baseline on the font and the baseline of the image don't line up. So I can either try and do it manually. There's some more advanced techniques for lining stuff up. But with the basic document flow that I've shown you, this is kind of something you have to do manually. It's really challenging. The other part is if you change the browser a bit,
oh yeah, it doesn't know.
It's gonna flow like a document. So eventually it's gonna wrap under. Right. What you typically would do if you want something to line up perfectly like that is you might put them in a table. Right.
Oh, and then the table would take priority for the border.
Right. Now there's better ways than the table. There's other structures that we can use, but they're more app centric than a page. Remember, page is kind of emulating a document.
Is there such thing as negative padding?
Yes, you can absolutely. Yep, you can do negative numbers there.
Okay, cool.
Right. Let's do that. So
I guess too, just a question. Like, it would be really like kind of bad ethics to do. Like, if you wanted that image to be, you know, towards the middle or something, if you did padding instead of a margin.
No, that's fine. It's just the padding isn't going to give you the middle.
Right. But like, you know, if it's like pushed out, I guess, you know, like would you want everything just kind of in a margin for that separation?
Yeah, there's a couple tricks to doing it with the design flow, but I'm not going to show you those tricks because they're really old. And in a couple lessons, I'm going to show you a nice way to lay things out.
Okay.
Okay. So I don't want to confuse you too much. Somebody, I'm sure, out there is very confused right now.
Many somebodies are very
right.
Well, let me do the negative. I'm going to play with it in the negative side here. So if I look at the page, you know, you're asking about, can I take this text and do a negative margin or a negative padding? I absolutely can. So up here, I can go margin top minus 20 pixels. And it doesn't actually have a, let's just do, the padding won't do it either. Could add the padding to the bottom. It's overridden. Let's get rid of that. I'm trying to play around. And here's where the positioning comes in. Is that kind of what you were looking for?
Yeah. And then I guess, yeah, if you want to connect that line.
So here I said position's relative. So it's relative to its parent. And then I made sure that this thing was exactly 23 pixels up from the bottom. This isn't going to scale well. As soon as the browser starts changing size, it's going to be ugly. Right.
Is that called responsive, right, or something?
No.
When you scale things down.
Yeah, no. There's a different way to deal with changing the browser size, and there's actually, like most things, a couple different ways. Okay, let's deal with those people who are like completely lost, going, what the heck is going on here? Because if you can get past this part, the rest of it's going to be kind of fun to play with.
I have a doubt.
Right.
I'm trying to do like a picture, but it appears like going to slogan.
Right. Okay. So share your screen.
Oh, it's the same in my iPad.
Well, that's okay. Just turn it around and show me.
So here's like my little search.
Yep.
And I have it in the same location as my web page.
Right.
And when I open it, it won't.
Okay. So back out again so I can see it, because generally when the image doesn't show up, it's because the source path that we're looking for is wrong. So if you undo the highlight, because I can't really see it with the, right? So there it's looking for an image in the current folder side by side with index.html.
Mm-hmm.
And if you pan up a little bit so I can see your folder. So what we want you to do there, first off, is put your images in a separate folder, because you're gonna get lots of them eventually. So if you look at the live share, you see I've got a separate assets folder. And then the second thing is that when you refer to the source attribute in your image, refer to that assets folder.
Oh, it's working now. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, it's getting used to the file paths. Yeah, shoot.
How can I put images side by side? Because like if you put a lot, they just like go below the other, right?
Yes. So, haven't really got there. If you use image tags, if you look at my live share, I'm using an image tag here. So the upside of the image tag is it's default, it's normal, it's been around forever, and you get the image. The downside is the image you get is exactly the size that the art is. This particular piece of art, if you actually open it up in VS Code, it'll open it. Cool, right? But that image has a specific size, and that particular image is 640 by 480. And there's no changing it with your image tag. There's another way to display images, and it involves CSS. So let me do it with CSS here. I'm going to comment this one out. My image goes away, and I'm going to create a div. Let's do it with an ID. Just like that. Okay. So I just have an anchor. This is just an HTML thing to attach some CSS to. And this is an ID. I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to go over to my styles. And over here, I'm going to create this ID. And I'm going to put a hashtag in front of it to say, hey, go find that ID, and here's what I want you to do with it. First thing, background image. And now I'm going to use the CSS function I haven't used before, but it's called URL. And URL lets me specify where that image is. Okay, now that URL function in your CSS assumes that it's wherever your CSS file is. And the tricky part here is my CSS file is in a CSS folder. So I have to go up one folder, that's the ... part. Okay. And then I have to go down into the assets folder, ... / assets, and then I have to go find a new Vic. Okay. That's the first part. The second part is background size. Those stupid pop-ups keep getting in the way. And I'm going to say it's 100%, 100%, width and height. Now what that's going to tell it is that what it should do is it should scale the image width and height to the size of the container. So now I can set the width on this. Let's say I make 256. And I can set the height. And you'll notice on my screen, my image is now scaled. Okay, so two different ways to do images. The image tag, which is the most straightforward, and you get the art exactly as you created it. The downside of that is if you have to change the size of the art 6 times to get it right, that's a really painful process of bringing the photo into Photoshop, changing its scale, saving it out again. Also, every different browser is going to be a different dimension or size. Doing it with CSS uses the background image, background scaling, and then you can change the width and height all you want, and it'll just automatically scale. There's a second bonus to this. The image tag is managed by your browser by using your computer's CPU, your processor, which for most computers is just fine. Some of our computers have some really sophisticated high-end graphics cards, hardware that does beautiful gaming and 3D stuff. Like all the computers at the school have these fancy RTX graphics cards. Using the background image, background size technique here, it uses that accelerated graphics hardware on your computer. And what that means for an end user is that any end user that has a nice accelerated graphics card gets faster, snappier images, and you get the ability to manipulate the scale, the size. You can do all sorts of crazy things there that I can't get into because they're just way too messy. We can do some pretty sophisticated stuff. Does that help?
Well, it does for scaling, but I wanted to know how to put images like next to each other.
Well, that's fine. If they're next to each other, you can do 2. Let me do another one. So again, at the point that the div has the image attached to it, I change the scale by changing the size of the div. So in this case, okay, and you can go a step further, which I'll show you in a second.
Oh, it's not like.
So now they're, and if I make, yeah. So now I get the 2 images side by side. Which, fun fact, I took both those photos.
Great pictures. Okay, yeah, that works. Thank you very much.
Okay. Now, to make it a little bit more efficient, I would suggest going a step further. I'm going to make a class called ImageBox, and I'm going to take the common parts of these things and put them in there and take it out of there. And now, if I add that class, to both of them, I get the exact same result because of the way it applies the styling. It applies the ImageBox class, and then it goes and applies the individual image. Cool part about this is if I go and change the width, they both change at once. I can just change the number in one place, they both change. Backgrounds are really, really powerful things. If we're doing like a divider bar, we'll use a background image, and we'll make that background image say 2 or 3 pixels wide to save on space and download time. And we'll use the background image with that little 2 or 3 pixel wide piece of divider bar. And then we'll use a background property called background repeat. And we'll just repeat it across the div, and then we'll size the div to whatever it needs to be. So you can mess with these things and play with them. Other specific things people are trying to look at and do?
I'm trying to understand what class stands for. Like, when should I use it?
Okay, so it should be the default thing you use. A class is like giving something a name. It's a search thing. So when you give
And the ID?
an ID is a specific individual element. So you can only have one. If you look at my live share, you can only have one div called container. But you can have as many instances of the class debug as you want. As many copies as you want. That debug class is something that the browser is going to search for. So when it goes through the CSS page, the CSS style sheet, it says, oh, here's a thing called .debug. That's a selector. So what this tells the browser to do is go look through all the HTML and find all the places where the class equals debug and apply this style to all of those elements. So the div one says go find all of the things that are divs in the HTML. And for every div, apply these styles to them.
So if I want to put like a little title with different like font sizes, I have to do a class. It's like dot header or dot like title.
Yeah.
And there I can put like the size and the font I want it different.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
And so if you break them up into smaller pieces, like I've done in a couple of these places, you may not have to redo the whole thing. These ones go find me the thing that has an ID called Inuvic image and apply this style to it. And there's only one of them. Whereas this, there could be many image boxes. And that's a good example to see here. If you look at that live share, I have two unique IDs, Inuvic image and whale image. But they both use the class image box. So they get the image box styles applied to them, and then they get their own unique background image. Right?
Okay, I get it. Yeah.
Starting to kind of make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
I also have a question.
Sure.
I'm having trouble with something.
Mm-hmm.
I can get the border to like just stay with the image initially. Yeah. So the border goes like some pixels away.
So it's got a little bit of a spacing around the image, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So this is part of the image is a specific size. And if you right click on that and show me the inspect. While you test my Spanish.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay, just leave it. I'm used to seeing it. Okay. So that image is 400 by 400 and inside the container. So push that off to the side. Put it to the right side instead of on the bottom so we can see more of it. In the upper right corner, there's a ... menu.
Okay.
And put it to the right side. There you go. Okay. So what we want to look at here is what are all the styles attached to the image, and then what are all the styles attached to the container that the image is in. So click on the container. Yeah. Oh, go highlight the container again with your mouse. So what you can see here is the dotted lines of where the actual content is in there. Right? And what do we got? Padding 0.25, margin 0.25. So test it out. If you go down at the very bottom of your page, you see it says div padding 0.25 margin. See the tick boxes there? Undo the tick boxes. Just for testing. It's not changing anything. It just shows you what it'll look like if those weren't there. Right? So you see the blue box in behind your picture?
Yeah.
Right? That's the size the blue box is going to be if you don't have those margins and padding.
Yeah, but now it's weird because like the image is bigger than the box.
Yep. Yep. Because the box is rescaling itself based on the width of the browser, whereas the image is in an image tag, so it can't change.
Okay.
Okay. So what we really want, like with the width, try in the image tag, try and make the width and the height percentage.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just right there. You can double click it. Just type 100%.
It's big. It's a big image. It will be
How's that?
okay. Oh, now it will.
Okay. Now, whatever you do in the inspector is just temporary. It's just a sandbox to play in. So you now have to go back to your HTML and
does it work the same like for the title? Like I just run this site.
Yep. Yep. But for the text, there's some separate styles for that. You might have to look up. There's a text align, so you can try and align it centered.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's centered.
Okay. The other thing you can do is, in my divs, I have that margin and padding set to 0.25. Honestly, I usually set the margin and padding to 0 for every div. That way I can not get messed up.
Okay.
Right?
Because I tried centering.
Yeah.
Like how to do it.
Right. You have a class called center, and your center class still tries to. Why don't you try something a little bit more like text align center.
Okay. How do I stop sharing? Okay. Thanks.
Okay.
Sorry. I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Yeah. So can I show you my diagram?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, basically, like for example, this section right over here, this would be its own div, right?
Right.
Like,
yes.
A div. This would be an image, and this would be another div, right?
Correct. And you'd probably have to have a div around the whole thing.
Around the whole thing, yeah. So how do I separate them? Like, well, if I want to start like building it in blocks, just to like keep it like as a placeholder, how could I do that?
Well, what you start doing is building kind of like I've done here in the live share. So you build multiple containers.
Because I'm trying, like for example, right now, I can't seem, like, for example, to get, like, for example, if I want one of the blocks to be white, I can't seem to get it to be white. Nothing comes out.
Right. So the first thing is each of the containers that you have has to have some size to it, has to have some content in it.
Oh, okay.
And usually when you don't see it at all, it's because there's zero content in it. So either the width or the height is 0.
Okay, so I would have to add the width and the height.
Yeah.
Kind of like if it was like a rectangle, right?
Right. The same as I did the little red box.
Okay, perfect.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. Who wants to be able to add nice custom fonts to their site?
Me, I tried downloading one and like adding it to the same address.
Yeah.
I can make it work.
So the easiest way to load fonts is to start with picking one that you like. And the fastest, easiest way to do that is to use the same link, but with a different set of parameters. So the way we do it, the easiest way, is if you search for Google Fonts, and they'll give you practically all the code you need here. But the first thing you need to do is find a font you like. Right. Let's go Google Fonts and dismiss. See available fonts. Here we go. Sure, that'll work. So now I've got this font. I can either download it and then try and load it from my assets folder. That's kind of the hard way to do it. Typically what we want to do is we want to link to it on the internet. And we can see all the different variations. What we're going to do here is try and grab it. Let's see. No, I don't want to download it. Where's the silly, gives you the sample. Let's pick this one. Let's pick this one. So you go select this style. And when you do select this style, it says to embed a font, copy the code into the head of your HTML. And there's a button here for link. So we're going to grab this, copy, and we'll go back to our live share. And in the head section, right underneath, or right before rather, our CSS, we're going to paste that in. And it doesn't matter how crazy it looks. We're just copying and pasting off Google Fonts. Okay. And then it tells you on that web page, CSS rules to specify families. And so you copy this. This is the CSS rule. And then you go to your style.css and say, I want all divs to use this font family. And then we go back and we look and we refresh our browser, and now I can use all that font family. And I just applied it to every div, but you could apply it to a particular class. You could apply it to heading styles. You could apply it to anything you like. So Google Fonts, search for a font. You can grab any of these. They're free to use. You're going to pick the variation you want, select this style. Right. Not let me grab it. Select this style. And it should give you the code to insert it. You don't really even need those. That'll still work. I need to grab the Google font URL. What else do we got here? There we go. So again, the real one that you need is the very last link. The very last link in Google Fonts there. The one behind my head. So you want to grab the last link there. You just, instead of doing it there, pull it down here. So once you pick one of these, you can click this button at the top, view your selected families. And what you want to do is pick the font you want, grab the last link out of there. And then it tells you which CSS font family you can now access. So I can add this font as well. I copy it, I go to my live share, and paste it in. You can get rid of the HTTPS part, it's kind of implied. And then I go into my style sheet. Let's put my title. And then I'll style my heading too. And I'll choose this font family. If it can't find the right font family, it will just pick sans serif. And now I've got both fonts running.
So basically, you first have to get the link, and then you add it to the style sheet, and then you add it to your header.
Right.
Kind of like the workflow, right?
Yeah. So grab the link to the font that's loading the font from Google's site. Add the name of the font family to whatever selector you want to use it in. And that will change anything with that selector to use this font family.
The selector would be H2, right?
Yeah, I chose an H2 because I just wanted it on this guy.
Okay, perfect.
But you could add it to a class just as easily. Now, some other things you can do. If you're thinking about your bio, you might want to have links to different parts of your document. So we would add links with an anchor tag. And actually, I'm going to put the name of it in there. So now that's a link, but of course links are this really ugly blue color, so I probably want to add some styling information. Or I can add it to all anchor tags. Let's just add it to the anchor tags. And now my links are light cyan. And if I want them to go somewhere else in the same page, I use a number sign and now I have to put an anchor to get or to land on. So when I click the link, where am I going to go? I'm going to go to the anchor called Home Info. I'm going to copy that. I'm going to create a whole other container here. What am I doing? Not spelling very well. Let's create a whole container. And let's say this is the place I want to go. When I click on this menu item, Home Info, I'm going to create an anchor in here. And I'm going to give it a name, Home Info. Just like that. Now when I click on the link, save it. Should take me right to that anchor. Looking for an ID, I guess. It's just going to an ID. Let's just use container 2. There we go. That's better. And we can do some fancy things styling that menu bar if we want. We can turn around and say, look, we want that menu bar we'll just call it a menu, right? And what do I want with that menu? Well, let's just create a class called menu here. And in that menu class, I want to stick it to the top of the page. Whenever you use a 0 as one of the numbers for the scale or the position or the padding or whatever, you don't have to put any units in there. Right? And let's turn around and do something fancy with them. Let's make it let's take the bullets off. I'm going to make the background a different color too. Oh, that'll hurt some people's eyes. There we go. Get rid of the bullets. Now, part of making this, see if I can. Let's kind of force that into a position there. Let's go with do Forgot how I made them go sideways. There we go. And one of the things that you might do, and that I'll leave you with at the end, is as you're poking at this stuff and you keep trying things and changing your CSS, when you get done, one of the things that's nice to do is to organize it a little bit. And the most common way to organize this is just alphabetically. It just makes it easier for folks. Something like that. If you're wondering, the bright green on fuchsia, if you ever see that kind of color scheme, it's kind of universally taught to any programmer everywhere as the color scheme that will force anybody with any artistic sensibility whatsoever to replace it as soon as possible. This is the "Hey artist, I need art" scream for help. Right? This is Programmer Art 101. So if you don't really like lime green on fuchsia, then you can probably replace it pretty quickly. I'm going to make mine and let's make the height a little bit smaller. So now you can start to play around with menu items and elements.
I don't know why the reference for the font, we can't quite get it to work.
So the hard part with getting fonts to work is you have to get the right address from Google.
Okay.
Right. So if I go to my Google fonts here.
Oh yeah, because there's so many, right?
Right. So what you typically do is go find the font you want. I rarely grab multiple at once. And the idea of downloading them is great if you're going to be a standalone, but for the most part, you're connected to the internet. So it's a lot faster and cheaper if you do it. Right. So what we're going to do when you look at that, we go back here. So I'm going to find this View Selected Families part. I'm going to pick the one I want. I'm going to make sure this is set to link. And what you can do is you can select the whole thing and copy it, Control C. And then go into your HTML file. And paste it right there in the head section. And it'll be really big and ugly. But one of the things is these first two pre-connect to Google Fonts and Google Static. Those are all performance. You don't really need them. The remaining link is what you need. That loads the font from Google's site into your site.
The href, right?
Yeah. And technically, you don't need this HTTPS part either. And you need to load them before your styles. The order matters. The other part you can get from the web page where you got the fonts is what are the CSS things you have to put in your CSS page to use that font. So they have to be loaded before style.css, and then in style.css you have to refer to them by the names they tell you. Well, you can add it to anything. I added one here.
I put .head and open the thing.
Right. Okay, so .head will look for a class equals head somewhere. So for instance, I have this ID called header, but if I do a style called .head, and then use, that's not the one, and then use what Google suggests here, copy that. So that's all three of them. So let's say I just want to use that one. So I have it loaded. I have Poppins and Lato loaded. I have Lato loaded twice. I'm only going to load it once. I load, and then I go into my style and I define a class using that font family. Now I have to use that on something. So I go back to my index. I don't have a head class used anywhere. Do this. And then it switches to that font. And if I take that class away, it should take that font away.
So if I want to add it to my title, like this class, like.
Yeah. Now I added it to my H2 tag. See right here? I added it to my H2 tag. So every H2 will use that font.
For the one in the top, every day we'll have that one?
Correct.
Let me take a picture. 1 second.
You can copy and paste it right out of the live share.
Sorry, I have a quick question. It's about I'm starting to get my hand on the CSS styles. You probably already said it, but how do I get to bring like a CSS style to my index.html once I wrote it down?
Well, you have your styles link, correct?
Yeah, I have my link, and I already have, well, let's say, what I want to do is, well, I don't know if this is the right way to do it, but so one of like the divisions I wanted to have a white background.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be like another container.
Yep.
So I would do that in the style sheet, and then I would try to bring it to the index.html, right?
Right. So the way you link the two together is with your styles. there's a collection of styles for each selector.
Yeah.
So you're searching for something in your HTML. You're either searching for a tag, or you're searching for class equals, or you're searching for ID equals. Okay? So you either match the ID in your HTML or the class in your HTML.
Oh, okay, yeah. So, for example, in my HTML, my class ID, my ID is intro, and on my styles, I added that kind of style called dot intro, so I could link it up. Right?
So when it starts with a dot, it's a class. So it looks for class equals. And when it starts with a hashtag, it's looking for ID equals. Okay. Now preference should be given to classes. So use classes wherever possible.
Yeah. Well, can I show you my screen?
Yeah.
Or how do we do this?
You run Discord on the same machine.
I'm running Discord now on a different machine.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I get it.
Yeah.
I get it. You need more screens.
Yes, exactly.
Right? There are dual screens at school, and if you're running on your own laptop, you can plug one of the school screens into your laptop.
Into my laptop?
Yeah. You need to look on the back of your laptop and on the back of the school screen to see what cables you need to make that happen.
Yeah, I think I have like a really weird cable. It needs to be like one of like those like squares. It's not an HDMI.
It's a display port.
Yeah, that's great.
Right. So it's either a large or a mini display port, but you can get cables that go display port to HDMI and display port to display port.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah. So basically, I had it like this. I don't know if this is gonna work. Can you see it?
Barely.
No. Barely. No.
That's okay. That's okay. Push your camera in close. Now you have to be super steady. Right. Yep. So you've got IDs. So class intro. So inside your CSS file, there should be a .intro selector.
Yeah, so I have it. Let me show you. I have my style right here, my style sheet, and I put it like .intro right there.
That's not where it goes. Not a separate file.
Oh, okay.
Everything goes inside the onestyle.css file.
Everything goes on which one? Sorry?
Look at my live share. Everything goes in one file called style.css.
Good. So I would have to but I do have it in one single file, right? Or I don't?
Show me.
Sorry.
There's another way to do this. Let's do this.
HTML, right?
Hold it. I can't see. It's moving. It's moving. It's moving. It doesn't go in your index.html.
Yeah. So it doesn't go there. It has to go to my style bio, right?
Right.
Here.
Right.
My .css style sheet.
Right. It's in your style sheet.
So this isn't supposed to be there, or
it shouldn't be in index.html. No.
okay.
Let's do this. Let's try this. Is that going to work?
Let me see that on okay. Yeah, I'm following.
Okay. So, my index.html loads my style sheet from my CSS style.css file.
Okay, yeah.
My style.css file has a list of all the selectors I'm using and the styles that are connected or grouped together with each selector. So there's my debug selector and my center selector and my fat underline selector, my red, my gray, box, everything. And when it starts with a dot, it should be referenced by the HTML file using the class attribute. So image box gets applied to everything that has class equals image box. Okay? Yeah. So what the browser does is it goes through style.css, so it loads all the HTML, and it goes through style.css and it says, okay, let's just start at the top. All things in the HTML tag get these styles applied to them. So it goes back here and applies those styles to that tag. Then it goes and says, okay, all divs get these styles. So it goes through here, and everywhere it finds a div, here, 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 all of those divs get a copy of these styles. Then it finds H2, and it says, put this font family as a style on any H2 elements. Oh, there's an H2 element. Then it goes and says, okay, go find stuff with the head style, class equals head, and apply this. Well, I don't have it anywhere here. It's not used. So I can get rid of it. It's not used. Now I go look for debug.
Oh, yeah, I see.
Do I have class equal debug? Yeah, class equal debug. So those styles get added to this guy. So every selector adds styles to something.
So, and every time I have to save the style sheet, I have to save it so it can also pop up like on the image.
Right.
HTML, right?
Right.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I was doing.
Yeah.
Thanks.
All right. All right, guys. I've given you tons of stuff to play with and a lot of it to pollute your brains. The next thing you guys need to do in building your biography is actually play with this stuff. And so it's real important that you spend some time messing around with it and breaking things. Okay? Don't be afraid to break things. Don't be afraid to delete things. When we come back next time, we're going to do a little bit more HTML and a little bit more CSS, and we're going to do a bunch of review of this stuff, and we're going to introduce kind of the next projects for you. All right? So have a good weekend. Try and spend a little bit of time playing with this over the weekend. It will pay dividends.